I am Joan of Arc. I fought not for glory, but for faith. Guided by voices divine, I rose from the ashes of war. And this is my story.
France was bleeding. Cities had fallen, kings were exiled, and the church stood trembling between two crowns. The 100 Years' War had torn a nation into shreds, and while nobles conspired in marble halls, peasants starved in the fields. Smoke from distant fires blackened the horizon, and every village prayed for salvation that never came. Yet, in the forgotten hamlet of Domremy, destiny was stirring quietly inside a farmhouse no one would ever have noticed. Joan of Arc, Jehan as her mother called her, was born in 1412, the fifth child of Jacques d'Arc and Isabelle Romay. They were simple people, tied to the land and the rhythm of survival. Her father was stern, distrustful of strangers, the kind of man who measured faith by labor. Her mother was gentler, but unyielding in devotion, the voice that taught Joan her prayers before she could even speak them clearly. Their world was small, the church, the fields, and the seasons. But within that narrow life, Joan found something vast, something eternal, something that would one day demand everything from her. She grew up listening to stories of saints and miracles told by the village priest, even though she couldn't read a single word of scripture. She absorbed the hymns, the faces of the statues, the trembling candlelight that made saints look alive. While other children played in the fields, Joan lingered in the chapel, staring at the altar until her mother had to pull her home. People said she was strange, too quiet, too solemn, too old for her age. Some nights her mother would wake to find her daughter praying in the dark, whispering words no one had taught her. When asked why, Joan simply said, "Because God must be lonely for someone to listen." Outside Domremy, the world was collapsing. English troops had burned villages not far from theirs. Farmers fled with what little they could carry, and soldiers, friend or foe, looted whatever was left behind. The name of France itself was fading, replaced by fear and surrender. But Joan, though she was barely a teenager, never seemed afraid. When she heard of raids, she wept, not from terror, but from sorrow. "If only I were a man," she once murmured, "I would ride to drive them away." Those around her laughed. She didn't. In the summer of her 13th year, the voices came. She was alone in the field, the air thick with heat, the hum of insects around her. Then a light, sudden and blinding, filled her vision. A voice, calm, commanding, neither male nor female, spoke her name. "Joan of God," it said. "Be good, go often to church, and one day you shall aid the King of France." She froze, her heart racing, and the light faded as quickly as it had appeared. She thought she was dreaming, but the voice returned days later, and then again. Soon there were 3 of them, St. Michael, St. Catherine, and St. Margaret, each shining with the radiance of heaven, each repeating the same impossible command: she was chosen to save France. At first, she said nothing. She prayed, fasted, and wept, asking God to take the burden away if it were a trick. But the voices only grew stronger, more certain. "Fear nothing," they told her. "The Lord will be with you." She obeyed. The next years of her life became a quiet preparation, a girl in armor of faith, waiting for a sign no one else could see. Domremy never understood her. She was different, not in madness, but in conviction. The villagers gossiped, her father warned her to stay silent, her mother begged her to think of her soul. But Joan believed that to disobey the voices was to betray heaven itself. She helped the poor, tended the sick, confessed weekly, and prayed daily. There was serenity in her face, but fire in her eyes, the kind that frightened even those who loved her. By 16, that fire demanded action. The voices told her to go to Robert de Baudricourt, the captain at Vaucouleurs, and tell him that God commands her to lead the Dauphin to his rightful crown. Joan didn't hesitate. She cut her hair short, dressed in a rough tunic like a soldier, and left home without permission. The road was long and dangerous, and the thought of a young peasant girl walking alone would have seemed suicidal. But somehow she reached the fortress. When she arrived, she declared before hardened soldiers that she carried a divine mission. They laughed at her, calling her the shepherd's fool, the witch of Lorraine. But Joan stood her ground. "I come from the King of Heaven," she said simply, "to help the King of France." Baudricourt dismissed her. But weeks later, when news came that the French had won a sudden and unexpected skirmish exactly as Joan had predicted, his doubt began to waver. He summoned her again. This time he looked into her eyes and saw no madness, no fear, only certainty. He gave her a horse, a sword, and a small escort to Chinon. As she mounted for the journey, the men around her fell silent. She rode as if born in the saddle, the banner of her faith invisible but unmistakable. And as she disappeared into the forest road, one soldier whispered, "That girl does not ride for herself. She rides for something we've forgotten how to believe in." In that moment, France began to breathe again. The road to Chinon stretched for nearly 300 miles. Forests, rivers, and lands still scarred by war. Most travelers were armed. Bandits roamed freely, and the threat of English patrols haunted every mile. Yet a 17-year-old peasant girl rode straight through it all, carrying nothing but faith and a command she could not ignore. To those who saw her, she must have looked absurd. Small, untrained, wrapped in a borrowed tunic, her hair shorn like a boy's. But there was something in her gaze, steady, luminous, unafraid, that silenced mockery before it began. Even the soldiers escorting her would later admit it felt as though she did not travel with us, but that we followed her. By the time Joan reached Chinon in March 1429, the war had dragged on for almost a century. France was more an idea than a country. The English held Paris and most of the north, while their Burgundian allies dominated the rest. Only a narrow region of the Loire Valley remained loyal to Charles, the uncrowned Dauphin. He lived like a ghost inside the crumbling castle of Chinon, a man born to rule, but too timid to try. He had seen defeat after defeat, betrayal after betrayal, and though courtiers still called him Your Grace, his kingdom was little more than rumor. When word reached him that a young girl had arrived claiming to be sent by God to restore France, the court erupted in laughter. A peasant prophet was the last thing a failing prince needed. But something about the reports, her confidence, her predictions, the strange discipline she demanded from the soldiers, made him curious. He ordered her brought to the great hall, but with a trick in mind. To test her, he disguised himself among his nobles, wearing no crown, no royal robe. When Joan entered, she paused only for a moment, looked across the hall, and walked straight to him. She bowed deeply and said, "God give you life, gentle Dauphin. I am sent to tell you that the King of Heaven has called you to be crowned in Rayon." The room fell silent. Even Charles, who had planned to expose her, was struck speechless. "You are mistaken," he said. "The king is there," gesturing toward another man in fine clothes. Joan shook her head. "No, fair sir," she replied softly. "It is you." That moment changed everything. The courtiers, the priests, even the Dauphin himself felt the air in the room shift. Some whispered that it was witchcraft. Others felt the undeniable weight of something divine. Over the following days, Joan was questioned by theologians, nobles, and generals. They demanded proof of her visions, evidence of her faith. She answered them all without fear or hesitation. "I do not know letters," she told the priests, "but I know this. God has sent me to save France. That is my truth, and I will answer for it only to him." Her simplicity disarmed scholars who had spent their lives debating scripture. Her certainty burned through cynicism like sunlight through fog. But even faith needed validation. The church ordered her examined by the clergy at Poitiers, a brutal, weeks-long interrogation designed to expose her either as a heretic or a fraud. Joan endured it all without faltering. When asked if she believed she was in God's grace, a question designed to trap her, she answered with a line that would echo through centuries. "If I am not, may God put me there. If I am, may God so keep me." The priests, stunned by her humility and wisdom, could find no fault. They declared her pure, her mission righteous. When she returned to Chinon, Charles finally agreed to test her not with words, but with action. The city of Orleans, the last major French stronghold in the Loire, had been under siege for months. If it fell, the road to southern France would open, and Charles's claim to the throne would collapse forever. No army had managed to break through the English lines. Joan demanded to be sent there. The court tried to reason with her. She had no military training, no experience. She only smiled. "I will not fight," she said. "I will lead. The men will follow, and God will deliver Orleans into our hands." It was madness, yet desperation often listens to madness when nothing else remains. Charles ordered a suit of armor forged for her, white and shining, and a banner of linen embroidered with lilies, bearing the names Jesus and Mary. When she first rode out from Chinon at the head of several hundred soldiers, the people crowded the streets to see her. Some shouted her name, others crossed themselves in awe or fear. A few jeered, but Joan did not look back. Witnesses said her eyes were fixed on the horizon, as if she already saw the light of victory burning there. As her convoy moved through the countryside, villages came to life. Peasants wept and threw flowers, priests rang bells, and soldiers who had abandoned the fight returned to arms. The rumor spread faster than her horse could gallop. A girl of God is leading France to war. In a land buried under defeat, hope itself became a weapon. At Guyenne, she joined the army of seasoned captains, men like La Hire and Dunois, rough, skeptical veterans who mocked her at first. They swore, gambled, and drank as soldiers did, until Joan forbade it in her camp. "You must confess and pray," she ordered, "for God does not grant victory to those who curse his name." Some resisted, but one by one they yielded. Her courage was contagious. Her purity shamed them. And when she spoke of France, her words cut through their cynicism like fire through frost. "Do you not love your country?" she asked a grizzled Knight. "Then fight for her as I will, with no fear and no doubt." By the time her army approached Orléans in late April 1429, Joan had become more than a girl. She was a symbol. To some, a divine messenger, to others, a fanatic. But to the soldiers starving inside the besieged city, she was salvation. As she rode through the gates, carrying her white banner high, people fell to their knees. "It is the Maid," they cried, "the one sent by God." Within hours, everything changed. Joan did not hide behind generals. She marched at the front, calling out to the enemy to surrender in peace or be destroyed. Her courage unnerved even the English. One archer who had mocked her name was struck by an arrow moments later, and the rumor spread that heaven itself was guarding her. The siege, which had lasted nearly 7 months, began to unravel under her presence alone. At dawn on May 7, she led a direct assault on the enemy's strongest bastion, the fortress at Les Tourelles. Amid arrows, smoke, and chaos, Joan stood on a ladder, raising her banner where the fighting was thickest. An arrow struck her shoulder. She fell, and panic rippled through the French lines. But moments later, she rose, blood streaming down her arm, shouting, "In God's name, onward!" Her soldiers surged forward. The fortress fell before nightfall. The next morning, the English army withdrew from Orléans. The siege was broken. For the first time in living memory, France had won a decisive victory. Soldiers wept, priests sang hymns, and the people proclaimed her the Maid of Orléans. The legend was born in fire and faith. That night, as the city celebrated, Joan prayed alone in a chapel, her armor dented, her wound unbandaged. She asked not for glory, but for guidance. "Lord," she whispered, "if this is your work, make me worthy of it." Somewhere in the distance, church bells rang through the smoke-filled sky, the sound of a country waking from a long nightmare. And for the first time in years, France dared to believe that it could live again. In the days after Orléans was freed, something extraordinary spread through France. Not merely news of a victory, but the birth of belief. From ruined villages to distant monasteries, people whispered of the girl who had ridden through fire and smoke with the banner of God. The Maid of Orléans became more than a savior. she became a living miracle. Where once men had fought for wages, now they fought for faith. Soldiers wore her emblem on their armor, peasants carved her image into wood, and even those who doubted found themselves praying under their breath that her hand might turn the tide again. But the victory at Orléans was only the beginning. Joan knew it. Her mission, as she claimed, had never been simply to win battles. It was to restore the crown of France to its rightful king. And for that, Charles VII would need to be crowned in Reims, the ancient city of coronations, deep within enemy territory. To reach it meant marching through towns still loyal to the English and their Burgundian allies. Every commander in Charles's army knew such a campaign bordered on madness, but Joan's conviction made hesitation seem like treason. She told them, "I was sent for this. We will go to Reims, though every gate be held against us." It was not just her words that stirred them. It was the way she carried herself. She slept on straw beside her soldiers, ate the same rations, endured the same exhaustion. She demanded that priests accompany every regiment, leading hymns before battle. When the men swore, she corrected them with a smile that felt like light breaking through smoke. Even the hardest knights came to speak of her with reverence, saying that in her presence they felt as though their souls had been washed clean. The march to Reims began in June 1429, and every step seemed guided by Providence. Town after town opened its gates without resistance. The English garrisons, demoralized and confused, withdrew rather than face her army. People lined the roads, shouting blessings as she passed. Chroniclers later wrote that the sight of her, a young woman in gleaming armor, her white banner fluttering in the wind, made men weep without knowing why. She represented something France had forgotten how to feel, hope that was not born of power, but of purity. At Auxerre, Joan addressed the army, "In God's name, let us march. He does not abandon those who do not abandon him." They rode day and night through rain, mud, and hunger, driven by the sense that history itself was watching. When they reached Troyes, the city resisted, closing its gates. The commanders debated siege plans, but Joan dismissed them. "We will enter by love, not by fear." Within days, the gates opened. The people surrendered without a single arrow loosed. To some, it was divine mercy. To others, a kind of sorcery. By mid-July, the army stood before the golden spires of Reims. The city that had crowned France's kings for centuries lay before them, still in enemy hands, but trembling. Joan sent a message to the city's council. "If you yield to your rightful king, you will be spared. If not, we will enter by the will of God." The next morning, the gates opened. Reims had chosen faith over fear.
And so, on July 17, 1429, the miracle reached its peak. Inside the great cathedral, beneath the shimmering light of stained glass, Charles knelt before the altar as the archbishop anointed him with holy oil. Trumpets echoed, choirs sang, and the crowd erupted in tears. For the first time, France had a crowned king again. And at the heart of that coronation, standing beside him in her armor, banner raised high, was Joan of Arc, a peasant girl who had turned prophecy into reality. Witnesses said Charles wept openly as she knelt before him, saying, "Gentle king, now is the will of God fulfilled." It was the moment she had lived for, yet even in triumph, shadows gathered at the edges of her victory. The nobles and courtiers who had once dismissed her now began to fear her. Her power was not political, yet it eclipsed every man in Charles's circle. Soldiers obeyed her before they obeyed their generals. The people called her the savior of France. The king, grateful but uneasy, began to listen to whispers that her voices were not from heaven, that her influence was dangerous, that France could not be ruled by the faith of a single girl. But Joan herself was blind to intrigue. She still thought only of God's mission. Now that the king is crowned, she said, "We must drive the English from Paris." Her heart burned for a France completely free. The generals hesitated. The The king's advisors warned him against it, but Joan's resolve was immovable. She marched again, leading an army toward the heart of the enemy's power. The attack on Paris came in September. The city was fortified, the English entrenched. Yet Joan rode forward as always, her banner bright against the smoke of cannon fire. She was struck by a crossbow bolt in the thigh, but refused to retreat. Her men dragged her from the field only when the order to withdraw came from the king himself. For the first time, victory had been denied her, not by the enemy, but by those she fought for. France had its king, but not yet its freedom. After Paris, Joan's influence began to fade. Her armies were disbanded. The court sent her on smaller missions, more symbolic than strategic. Yet she never lost her faith. "The work is not done," she told her followers. "God still has need of me." But in the quiet halls of Chinon, the whispers grew louder. Advisors urged Charles to distance himself from her. Some feared the church's suspicion, for how could a girl claim divine voices without being touched by heresy? Others simply envied her glory. Still, to the people she remained a legend. When she rode through villages, children ran to touch her horse. Priests called her a gift from heaven. But the tide of politics is cruel, and miracles rarely survive it for long. By early 1430, Joan could feel the silence from the court, a coldness that stung more than any wound. Yet she refused to rest. She joined a small garrison in Compiègne to defend the town from Burgundian forces. Her captains warned her it was hopeless, but Joan's purpose had never depended on odds. Better to fall in God's service than to live in fear. In the spring of that year, the English gathered their strength once more. France was no longer a corpse, but it was still bleeding. The crown had been restored, but the Savior's path was leading her away from glory and towards something darker, something inevitable.
Even the brightest fire casts shadows. After the coronation at Reims, Joan of Arc's fame spread across France like sunlight over a stormy land. Soldiers sang of her courage, peasants painted her image on walls, nobles whispered both awe and fear in the halls of their castles. Yet beneath the triumph lay unease. Politics is an unpredictable current, and the currents of court intrigue, envy, and suspicion move faster than any army. Joan had achieved miracles with her faith and her banner, but in the world of men who measured power in gold and alliances, miracles were fragile. Charles VII, now crowned and clothed in the authority of a king, was grateful but cautious. The clergy, whose blessing had legitimized him, watched Joan with both reverence and suspicion. Some admired her courage, others feared the authority she wielded without title, without bloodline, without precedent. Every victory she had achieved now posed a question the court could not answer. Could a peasant girl, guided only by visions, influence kings and nations? To many, her presence was a gift, to others, a threat. Joan herself remained untouched by courtly games. Her thoughts were simple and absolute. She must drive the English from France entirely. Her army, though small and worn from constant campaigns, rallied to her spirit. When she spoke of Paris, of Normandy, of every French town under foreign banners, her men felt the certainty of divine purpose. Yet with each command, she felt the subtle shift in the air. Cautious glances, whispered doubts, questions behind her back. She had no time for politics, no interest in strategy beyond the call of God, and for that, the wheels of betrayal began to turn. By late 1430, Joan led a small force toward Compiègne, a city of strategic importance on the northern approaches to Paris. The Burgundians, allied with the English, had fortified the town. Joan's plan was bold: break the siege, inspire the population, and reassert French strength near the capital. Her captains warned her against overextending her forces, but she refused caution. To her, hesitation was betrayal of God's mission. On May 23, 1430, she rode into the fields outside Compiègne with only a few hundred men, determined to confront an enemy that outnumbered them many times over. It was a trap. The Burgundians, waiting with a larger, better prepared force, encircled her. The army panicked, confusion spread like wildfire. Amid the chaos, Joan fought with her banner in one hand, her sword in the other, calling out to her soldiers, "Do not falter, God is with us." But even her courage could not hold the collapsing lines. She was captured, surrounded, and taken prisoner by the Burgundians. Witnesses later described her composure in that moment as extraordinary. Unlike a frightened child, she stood upright, calm, and defiant. Her captors knew her value, not as a soldier, but as a symbol. To the English and Burgundians, she represented the heartbeat of France, the living proof that victory had a human face. If she were executed, the French morale could be broken. If she were ransomed, her fame might be contained. Joan, however, refused to bow to political calculation. She refused compromise. Even in captivity, her mind remained on her mission: liberate France. Charles VII made no immediate attempt to rescue her. The court's hesitation was deliberate. Joan's capture presented a dilemma: a peasant girl commanding loyalty, wielding influence, and overshadowing the king himself. Political caution outweighed heroic impulse. Allies whispered to one another, wondering if her influence was now a danger rather than a gift. To Joan, this silence was incomprehensible. She had risked everything for him, for France, for God, and now the king's court hesitated while her fate hung in the hands of the enemy. In the castle of Beauvoir, where she was first imprisoned by the Burgundians, Joan remained steadfast. She refused to eat lavishly, refused to negotiate, refused to surrender her purpose. She wrote letters to Charles, pleading for ransom or assistance, but the answers were slow, cautious, evasive. Yet even in isolation, she inspired awe among her guards. She spoke of God's will with a clarity that unsettled men who had seen too much death to believe in miracles. Some guards confessed later that they treated her with respect, even reverence, because they sensed her power extended beyond the flesh. Soon she was handed over to the English, who had long feared her influence. They understood the danger she posed. As long as she lived, the French might believe that God had not abandoned them. The English, therefore, sought not to debate her, but to destroy her. She was moved to Rouen, the seat of English power in northern France, where a trial awaited. A trial designed not to seek truth, but to manufacture condemnation. The charges were both religious and political. They accused her of heresy, of witchcraft, of wearing men's clothing, and of claiming visions without clerical validation. To the English, these accusations were convenient. To Joan, they were absurd. Yet she faced them with the same unflinching certainty that had carried her through Orleans and Rheims. Each interrogation was designed to break her spirit. Priests and judges questioned her relentlessly, trying to find a word, a gesture, or a belief that could be twisted into proof of guilt. She countered each charge with clarity, humility, and an unwavering devotion to God. Even in the darkest hours, Joan's inner fire did not dim. She refused to acknowledge the king's silence as betrayal. She refused to plead for mercy. She remained certain that God was watching, that her mission was not yet complete, that France's destiny was larger than her own suffering. Every insult, every insulted interrogator, every threat of death, these only strengthened her resolve. Witnesses later wrote that her presence during the trial radiated a dignity and calm that few could endure to look at directly. And yet, behind the walls of Rouen, shadows lengthened. Joan's freedom was gone. The crown that she had helped place on Charles's head was secure, but the kingdom itself remained divided. Politics and pragmatism had overtaken faith and courage. The allies who had once cheered her victories now spoke quietly about her downfall. Betrayal had many faces: fear, envy, calculation, and the cold indifference of a king who needed her legend but not her life. In the candlelit halls of Rouen, Joan contemplated the journey from Domremy to Rheims, from Orleans to the heart of France. She remembered the fields where she first heard God's voice, the faces of soldiers who had followed her without question, and the prayers of people who had dared to hope. And though the walls of her prison closed in, she knew one thing with absolute certainty. Her life, no matter how brief, had already changed the course of history. The fire that had begun in a small village was now trapped behind stone and steel, but it was not extinguished. It would burn, and it would illuminate the world.
Rouen, in the spring of 1431, was a city trapped between fear and power, its cobblestone streets shadowed by the banners of occupation. The English ruled, but the people whispered of a girl whose presence had once turned tides, freed cities, and crowned kings. Joan of Arc, now 17,
sat within the cold stone walls of the castle prison, a prisoner not just of men, but of a world that feared her certainty. The air was thick with the smell of damp, the faint odor of smoke from distant fires, and the inevitability of judgment. Her every movement was observed, recorded, twisted for the advantage of those who would see her broken. From the very beginning, the trial was designed to humiliate, to corral her spirit into submission. Clergy loyal to England interrogated her endlessly, asking the same questions in different forms, hoping to confuse or trap her. They demanded she admit to witchcraft, to recognize false visions, to submit to ecclesiastical authority over her divine mission. Yet Joan, the girl from Domremy, refused to bend. Each question was met with calm defiance. "I am sent by God, and I will answer only to Him." Her voice carried a certainty that unsettled the judges. Some leaned closer, trying to find the human flaw, the tremor of fear, but her presence radiated a dignity impossible to dismiss. The accusations grew more intricate. Wearing men's clothing, they argued, was a mark of heresy. Yet Joan explained simply, "It is for my protection. Without it, I cannot serve the Lord nor fulfill His will." Each explanation, though clear, only made the court more desperate. How could a simple peasant girl command armies, inspire loyalty, and endure hardships beyond imagining, and still claim divine guidance without faltering? Every logical trap they set, she turned with ease. Not arrogance, but the quiet power of truth. Behind the scenes, politics and fear guided the proceedings more than doctrine. Charles VII had not intervened. The king who owed his throne to her courage remained silent, as if the myth he needed might be more secure in chains than in freedom. Allies whispered that ransom was possible, that some bribes might save her life, yet no one dared act decisively. In their hesitation, betrayal took shape. Joan understood, in ways the judges could not perceive, that human fear often outweighs justice. She bore it with a patience that astonished both friend and foe. The trial dragged on for months. She was denied proper counsel, moved repeatedly between cells, and subjected to constant scrutiny. The judges attempted to intimidate her with threats of death and hellfire, yet Joan's faith never wavered. When asked to renounce her visions, she refused. When asked to plead for mercy, she remained silent. The human instruments of power could not touch her inner flame. Witnesses described moments when she paused, eyes closed, as though speaking to an unseen presence, and emerged stronger, calmer, unbroken. Her captors grew frustrated. The girl who had once led France's armies was no longer a threat on the battlefield, but she remained a threat to authority, to fear, to those who understood that her story had already conquered hearts. The English needed more than conviction. They needed spectacle, confession, a demonstration that even divine favor could be crushed by men, and so they orchestrated her condemnation, relying on loopholes, ambiguities, and intimidation. Every clause of the trial was tailored to ensure a guilty verdict, yet Joan faced it all without yielding. As the days shortened toward May 1431, Joan was brought to the final hearing. The cathedral at Rouen was packed with spectators, soldiers, and clergy, all eager to witness the conclusion. Her appearance was striking. In her armor, she radiated both innocence and authority, the symbol of her nation compressed into a single figure. She knelt, not in submission to her judges, but in the calm acknowledgement of her God. The sentence was read: heresy, disobedience, and moral corruption. The words fell heavy, but they could not pierce the armor of her spirit. Even as the verdict was pronounced, she spoke, her voice carrying across the stone hall. "If I have erred, may God forgive me. If I have spoken truly, may God judge you who condemn me." It was not a cry of defiance, but of transcendence. She had always understood that mortality could claim her body, but it could not claim her purpose.
and in that moment every eye that witnessed her recognized the truth. The Maid of Orleans was beyond earthly authority. The sentence of death was finalized. She would be burned at the stake. Preparations were made swiftly. Guards bound her, and she was led through the streets of Rouen to the place of execution. The crowd, both fearful and awestruck, pressed close. Some wept openly, others cursed. Some simply stared, unable to comprehend the courage of a single girl facing the inevitability of fire. She carried herself with serenity, her gaze fixed not on the flames, not on the men who would end her life, but on God. On May 30th, 1431, the pyre was built. Joan's hands were bound, the fire was lit. Smoke and flames rose into the sky. But even as the heat surrounded her, witnesses said she held her head high. She recited the names of saints, prayers she had carried since childhood, and, according to some accounts, her last words were a simple plea to God to forgive her enemies and protect France. As the flames consumed her body, the city of Rouen shuddered under the weight of history. The girl who had led armies, restored a king, and defied kings herself became one with legend. Even in death she was unstoppable. Her courage, faith, and vision left a mark that no human could erase. For decades her story traveled the lands she had walked, inspired songs, painted images, and ignited revolts. She became a symbol, not merely of a single victory, but of what faith, conviction, and courage could achieve in the face of impossible odds. Betrayal could claim her body, but it could not claim her spirit. The flames at Rouen were meant to extinguish her, but history refused to comply. Within years, miracles were attributed to her. Stories of her visions circulated. The church began to reconsider her trial. By the time she was canonized in 1920, the world had long recognized that Joan of Arc had not merely lived, she had reshaped destiny itself. And in every village, battlefield, and court that had once doubted her, the echo of her courage remained. She was Domrémy's child, France's savior, the Maid of Orleans. And even the fire could not silence her voice.
The fire at Rouen consumed her body, but it could not consume her story. As the smoke rose over the Seine, whispers began to circulate among the witnesses. Soldiers spoke of her courage. Villagers recounted her unwavering faith. Priests recorded her final prayers. Even in death, Joan's presence lingered, intangible, impossible to erase. The English hoped to bury her influence alongside her charred remains, yet it spread faster than any army, carried not by banners, but by hearts, by memory, by awe. France, battered and divided, slowly began to reclaim its sense of identity. Towns liberated by her courage honored her in small ways. Crosses erected in fields, songs sung in the marketplaces, stories passed from parent to child. Monarchs who had benefited from her victories, including Charles VII, now faced a new truth. They owed not just crowns, but national survival to a girl whose life had been taken far too early. Her absence was palpable, her spirit was undeniable. Decades passed. France's enemies changed, battles were fought, kingdoms rose and fell. But the legend of the Maid of Orleans endured. In 1456, a retrial, long delayed, exonerated Joan. The very court that had condemned her acknowledged that her trial had been unjust, that her faith had been true, that her life had been exemplary. The church recognized the enormity of the error. They had judged a saint with human fear. Her name was cleared, her story restored. Centuries later, scholars, artists, and leaders would continue to draw inspiration from her life. Paintings captured her in mid-battle, sword raised, banner aloft, light streaming behind her as if she were lit by heaven itself. Poets wrote of her courage, her visions, her unwavering devotion. plays retold her story on stages across Europe, ensuring that each generation understood the singular bravery of the peasant girl from Domremy. And in 1920, nearly 500 years after her death, the Catholic Church canonized her. Joan of Arc, the Maid of Orleans, became Saint Joan, the embodiment of courage, faith, and national identity. Statues rose in cathedrals, her face was immortalized in stained glass, and prayers invoked her as a protector and guide. Her journey from village child to national icon, from soldier to martyr, from captive to saint, had transcended time, geography, and politics. She had become more than history. She had become a symbol, a legend, a force that no tyranny could contain. Yet Joan's legacy is not merely in monuments or canonizations, it lives in the human spirit, in every moment when courage must face fear, when faith must withstand doubt, when conviction must stand against power. She remains a reminder that one person, even the most unlikely, can alter the course of nations, that the smallest voice, when spoken with truth and bravery, can shake thrones and inspire generations. The girl who had once run barefoot through the fields of Domremy, who had listened to voices in the wind, who had seen the impossible and dared it to exist, she had become immortal. And across centuries, through fire, betrayal, exile, and canonization, her story continues to illuminate the world. For Joan of Arc, the maid, the martyr, the saint, prove that even the humblest of beginnings can change history, and that courage, guided by faith, can never be destroyed. In the end, it is not just the victories or the crown or the trial that defines her. It is the enduring light she left behind, a fire that no human hand can ever extinguish.